The final war of My Hero Academia is upon us, and Deku needs to master all the quirks inside of One For All. In the recent chapters of My Hero Academia, both the students and the heroes are prompted with the task to take down as many fodder villains associated to the Paranoble Liberation Front and the League of Villains. And Deku and Class A, with the supervision of Mount Lady, are about to start the mission to defeat some villains while at the same time boosting their strength and learning techniques for the real war that's coming soon. This is important because the final war of My Hero Academia is said to be starting soon, and being that Deku will inevitably be going up against a 100% all for Shigaraki, if he isn't at 100% mastered One For All, My Hero Academia will end with the villains having a win. Now, when it comes to looking at Deku and mastering One For All, there are multiple ways that you have to view it. The first and most important way of viewing it is by asking the question, can Deku effectively master 100% One For All before Shigaraki awakens? The second question is, how will Deku master 100% One For All before his fight with All For Shigaraki? And the last question is, if he can't, then how will My Hero Academia end? To get the most context into the question of can Deku actually master One For All, you have to separate the mastery of what One For All is. There's two main elements of the One For All quirk that Deku has to master separately and together. One of those elements is the mastery of the percentage inside of One For All, which is just Deku getting to 100% of the stockpile quirk inside of One For All, but Deku also has to master all of the individual quirks that are also inside of One For All, which is arguably the most difficult task for Deku, considering the fact that Deku hasn't used all the quirks inside of One For All in the first place, along with something that was mentioned by the One For All users that's going to make it even more difficult for Deku to master One For All in this short period of time. So first, let's talk about where Deku is and how many quirks he has mastered so far. Hey! Wise. Now, based on the recent chapters of My Hero Academia, Deku is currently at 45%. However, there needs to be a caveat placed on this, because in Deku's time of going rogue and defeating a lot of villains, he was constantly using 45%, so much so that I personally believe that Deku is at a higher percentage than just 45%. So to give Deku the benefit of the doubt, I'm going to say that Deku could very much be at 45%, but he could also be about 55 and max 60% of One For All. And even though I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that he's at a higher percentage, even though we don't know what percentage he currently is at, 50% and 60% of One For All still is nowhere near close to being able to rivaling the power of All For Shigaraki, which completely destroys the idea that Deku currently right now in his mastery of One For All will be able to contend with the likes of All For Shigaraki. Now, when it comes to the quirks that Deku has mastered, it's actually important to note that some of the quirks inside of One For All doesn't need mastering. For example, Smokescreen isn't a quirk that necessarily needs to be mastered, instead it needs to be understood. In My Hero Academia chapter 308, which is the first time that we actually see Deku use the Smokescreen quirk, immediately after using it, In, who is the 6 One For All user, told Deku that he used too much of his Smokescreen quirk. So when it comes to quirks like Smokescreen, it's just having the mindset or battle tactics that will allow you to use Smokescreen in the best possible scenarios. Another One For All quirk that doesn't necessarily need to be mastered is Float. Unless Float has some hidden ability that we currently do not know about, it only allows Deku the ability to fly. And it's so much of a quirk that it doesn't need to be mastered that Deku doesn't even call out the quirk's name before he utilizes it, unlike every other quirk inside of One For All. And Fajin also seems like a quirk that Deku doesn't necessarily need to master, and in fact it's a quirk that allows him to regulate his powers better, where Fajin is more so how much energy he stores up into one singular point and it bursts out, again making it something that Deku just needs to regulate and understand based on the battle tactics rather than having to master. Now, there is a quirk inside of One For All that Deku has mastered, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Horikoshi did say that Black Whip is the quirk that is active 24/7 now, making it so that Deku doesn't really have to think about using Black Whip and he just does it instinctually. But that still leaves 3 quirks: One For All, Danger Sense, and whatever the second user's quirk is. So currently, Deku is in a position to where he's anywhere between 45 and 60% One For All mastery, only having truly mastered one quirk out of the 3, and the 3 other quirks inside of One For All doesn't seem to me as if they need to be mastered, and it's more so that he needs to have better IQ so that he can use them better. So now that there's a general understanding as to where Deku is when it comes to his mastery in One For All, we have to look at what he actually needs to do to master One For All. Because as I said earlier, there are two elements to One For All: the stockpiling percentages of One For All, which shows what percentage he is in One For All, and the mastery of the quirks inside of One For All at the exact same time. But I also said that he has to join those two together, which would officially make it so that Deku has actually mastered One For All. By the way, if you want to collect My Hero Academia mangas, check out my Amazon shop store where you can purchase every single volume of My Hero Academia and I get a small commission for your purchase. The link will be in the description and also in the pinned comment. So in answering the question of what Deku needs to do to actually master all the quirks inside of One For All, the answer is simple, and it was stated by the second greatest character in the entire story of My Hero Academia, Endeavor. During the Class 1A versus 1B joint training arc, Deku unlocked his first quirk inside of One For All, which was Black Whip. And fast forwarding to the events in the Endeavor Agency arc, he was trying to figure out how he's able to implement Black Whip with what he's doing with One For All Full Cow. As Endeavor was giving both Bakugo and Shoto the task that they should be focusing on to better utilize their quirks, he gave Deku the blueprint to mastering all his quirks inside of One For All, saying that Deku needs to understand the process of parallel processing, which is to essentially be able to process multiple things at one particular time, but the best way to get to parallel processing is by focusing on one particular quirk, getting to a high level of competency, so much so that it's almost instinctual in your nature, and then adding another quirk after that. So essentially, Deku needs to focus on mastering one quirk at a time, and as those quirks become more instinctual to the point where he doesn't necessarily have to think consciously about what he's doing, then he'll be able to process another quirk on top of that quirk. The concept of parallel processing was further emphasized during Deku's battle against Lady Nagan, as in My Hero Academia chapter 313, when Deku was trying to use multiple quirks at once. The third user of One For All mentioned that Deku isn't yet ready to use his quirk. And although Deku was stubborn and decided to still use Fajin, he came to the realization in My Hero Academia chapter 314, where his body stalled up because his parallel processing, or using multiple quirks at once, wasn't aligned. So instead of using 45% One For All, Danger Sense, Smoke Screen, and Fajin at the exact same time, Deku decided to use the two quirks in which he was already a master at, which is the One For All stockpile quirk at 45%, and Black Whip, in which we know that Horikoshi said is pretty much a constant thing for Deku now, and then add on one more quirk to his parallel processing, which is Fajin, to effectively defeat Lady Nagan. So the only way Deku can master One For All is if he squares away his parallel processing. But in order to do that, he needs to focus on a particular quirk at a time, and then master that to the point where it's nearly subconscious and he can activate it and deactivate it without even focusing too much on it. But here comes a huge problem. Deku has not yet mastered 100% One For All. He hasn't yet mastered the true power of Danger Sense, but more important than anything, Deku still hasn't utilized the second One For All user's quirk at all, which is very important for this video, mainly because in order to parallel process everything, he needs to be able to use everything. And if he hasn't even used the second One For All user's quirk, very much possible because he needs a lot of energy to be able to use it. And then considering the fact that My Hero Academia is said to be ending within the next year, so the final fight between Deku and All for Shigaraki is going to be coming relatively soon, it is very difficult for me to believe that Deku is going to not only get to 100% One For All, but also mastering the parallel processing with all the quirks inside of One For all before the final fight with All for Shigaraki at the end of My Hero Academia, without a time skip of some sort. Now, it is very much possible that Horikoshi can just write Deku to be stronger than what he actually is. But if we're going to be consistent with how My Hero Academia currently is, Deku is only between 45 and 60% One For All. And he hasn't even used one of the quirks that he needs to master inside of One For All to be able to be at his fullest potential. Meaning that there's a 0.0% chance that if Deku were to go up against All for Shigaraki at 100%, he would come out as the victor. And assuming that Horikoshi is going to have a 100% Deku fighting up against a 100% Shigaraki at the end of My Hero Academia, then the only consistent way that I can see My Hero Academia ending is if there is a subtle 1 month or 2 month time skip where Deku, Bakugo, and Shoto are going to be training their quirks with each other while also fighting against some of the villains, so that the Paranormal Liberation Front or the League of Villains can have a numbers advantage over the heroes before the final war. And that, along with plot armor, can give Deku ample amount of time to train train with Bakugo on the second One for All uses Quirk, develop his parallel processing, and get as close to 100% One for All as he possibly can. But being that the final war and subsequently the final battle between Deku and Shigaraki is fairly close, if Horikoshi goes the route where Deku is not at 100% One for all that means is that My Hero Academia is not going to end. And what I mean by that is there's a high probability that there is a Shippuden-like or a part 2 to My Hero Academia. But I'm going to save that for a completely different video. But you need to watch this video because it talks about more My Hero Academia stuff. Wing His Zone every single